The investigators weren't expecting much. A dead man's estate in Santa Fe, a routine inventory, check the rooms, log the contents, move on. Then someone pulled back a floor panel in one of the outbuildings and found a steel door. Not a hatch, not a trapdoor, a door. Set into a reinforced concrete frame, sealed flush with the ground, with hardware that looked less like something protecting valuables and more like something built to survive a catastrophe. Nobody on the team had been briefed on this. There were no permits in the public record that explained it. No mention in any interview the owner had ever given, and Gene Hackman had given very few. He had spent the last 2 decades in deliberate, almost total retreat from public life. No social media, no profiles, no appearances. Just the property, the desert, and apparently this. The door was rated for blast pressure. That's not a spec you order when you're building a wine cellar. It's not a spec you order for a panic room either. Not a standard one, anyway. It's a spec with a very specific purpose. And the question nobody could answer standing there above it was simple. What exactly did the man who built this think was coming? Gene Hackman was not a man who retired. Retirement implies a gradual stepping back, a winding down, a few final curtain calls. What Hackman did was different, and it started earlier than most people realized. He made his last film in 2004. Not because the offers stopped. They didn't. He was offered serious money, serious directors, serious parts. He said no to all of them, quietly, and then he stopped saying anything at all. By 2004, he had made himself structurally unreachable. No agent, no publicist, no listed address, no manager fielding calls on his behalf. Colleagues who tried to reach him described the experience as something closer to witness protection than retirement. The architecture of a man who had not merely stepped away from an industry, but had methodically removed every thread by which that industry could find its way back to him. The Santa Fe property wasn't a vacation home. It became the whole world by design. High walls, desert acreage with natural sightlines that made approach visible from a distance. A man who had won 2 Academy Awards and whose face had been one of the most recognized on the planet, had arranged his life so that almost no one knew where he was. And that raises a question the tunnel only sharpens. Because deliberately erasing yourself from public life is one thing. Building a blast-rated door under your house is another. The first is eccentricity. The second is preparation. What exactly was Gene Hackman preparing for? What he was preparing for is a question that gets harder to answer the more you look at what he actually built. Because the tunnel and the blast-rated door were only the most dramatic elements. The Santa Fe estate, examined piece by piece, doesn't read like a rich man's retreat. It reads like a facility. The property drew its water from its own independent supply. Not municipal lines. Not a shared well, but a private system engineered to run indefinitely regardless of what happened in the wider infrastructure around it. Power generation was on site and self-contained. The perimeter monitoring was, by the assessment of people who evaluated it after the discovery, more sophisticated than the security systems protecting most active heads of state. Not former heads of state, active ones. The kind currently running countries. So the question that settles over all of this is a simple one, and it doesn't have a comfortable answer. Why does a retired actor need infrastructure that reads like a continuity of government facility? Why design a private residence to function after the grid goes down, after supply lines break, after whatever it is you're afraid of finally arrives? Part of the answer lives in who Hackman actually was, not the roles but the man underneath them. Because the disappearance wasn't impulsive, it was the final move in a withdrawal that had been building for decades, driven by something that went much deeper than a distaste for celebrity. The withdrawal explains the silence, but silence, eventually, draws attention of its own kind. When investigators first entered the Santa Fe property, they were not looking for anything extraordinary. The initial purpose was straightforward. A welfare check escalated by circumstances, the kind of procedural entry that happens dozens of times a year across New Mexico. 2 vehicles, a small team, standard protocol. The outer gate was functional. That was the first thing they noted. Not locked against them, but operational, running on independent power when the surrounding area had no particular reason to supply it. They logged it and moved through. The first rooms read as lived in, then less so, then not at all. A stillness that wasn't recent. The kitchen preserved in a way that felt deliberate rather than abandoned. documents on a desk arranged with a neatness that suggested someone had intended to return, or had intended to leave things exactly as they were. It was the study that changed the register of the whole investigation. One team member, moving along the far wall, stopped, knocked again in a different spot, then again, methodically, working inward from the baseboard. The subfloor rang hollow. Not in one place, in a pattern. Too regular, a colleague later said, to be accidental, like someone had measured it. Whatever was beneath that floor had been sealed. The question no one could answer yet was how long ago and what exactly the ceiling was meant to protect. They cut the subfloor in a grid, following the hollow pattern, until the seam of a panel gave way. Not rotten wood, machined edges, a hatch fitted so precisely into the surrounding planking that it had been invisible to every inspection the property had ever passed. The team heard it before they saw anything, a faint mechanical hum from below. Then the hatch swung open, and the smell stopped everyone cold, because there was no smell, no dust, no the damp earth exhale you'd expect from a sealed underground space that had been sitting for years or decades. The air that came up was climate-controlled, cool, dry, moving. The ventilation system was still running, not running because someone forgot to shut it off. Running on a timer, a programmed cycle, actively maintained, set by someone who expected to come back to this place and wanted to find it exactly as they'd left it. The investigators looked at each other. If the ventilation was still on a live schedule, the question wasn't what had been preserved down there. The question was what else was still running, what else was waiting. They shone the first light through the hatch. Below the study floor of one of Santa Fe's most private estates was a descending staircase, concrete walls, and a space that was by any measure built to last. The staircase dropped 14 steps. Not a ladder, not a crawl space. 14 poured concrete steps, each one level and uniform, with a steel handrail bolted into the wall on a standard residential pitch. Someone had built this to be used regularly, comfortably, in the dark if necessary. At the bottom, a room approximately 22 feet long, 11 feet wide, 8 feet of clearance overhead. Those dimensions matter because they aren't accidental. They conform to a spatial logic, enough floor area to function, enough height to move without crouching, proportions that maximize usable volume while minimizing the excavation footprint. Whoever specified this room had thought about efficiency. And then the walls. The walls were poured concrete reinforced with rebar on a schedule used in Cold War-era military construction. Not a contractor upgrade you could stumble into at a hardware store, but a specification that had to be sourced and requested deliberately. Someone knew what grade to ask for. Someone had a blueprint, or a contact, or both. The question that opened up in that room, standing under those 8 feet of engineered ceiling, was a simple one. Who designed this? Where did the specifications come from? The objects on the floor didn't answer that. A metal shelving unit, bolted to the far wall. Several sealed storage containers, olive drab, the kind rated for long-term climate exposure. And in the corner, a second electrical panel, live, with indicator lights still green. The ventilation loop they'd found upstairs wasn't the only system still drawing power. Something else in this room was on. The indicator lights answered the first question. Whatever was drawing power in that room was keeping the sealed containers at a controlled temperature. Not refrigerated, but regulated. Held within a narrow band that prevents degradation over years, not weeks. When investigators opened them, the inventory didn't read like a hoarder's cache or a collector's overflow. It read like a prepared position. Long shelf life provisions, vacuum sealed, with production dates suggesting they'd been rotated within the last few years. Someone had been maintaining this, not abandoning it. Physical copies of financial instruments, the kind that don't require a network or a server to redeem. And then the maps. Topographic surveys of the American Southwest, detailed, printed on archival stock, current as of within the last 5 years. Not decorative, annotated. Take any one item and you have an explanation. Take all 3 together, and you have a logic. This wasn't nostalgia stored underground. It was infrastructure, built around the assumption that at some point, the things most people rely on might stop working. Power grids, financial systems, digital records, which forces the question the room couldn't answer on its own. Was this built for survival? A wealthy man's private hedge against catastrophe? Was it built for secrecy? Materials and records kept deliberately off the grid, invisible to anyone without the key? Or was there something more specific driving the design? A threat, a timeline, a plan? Because the specifications that built this room didn't come from fear alone. Fear builds a safe room. This required an architect, someone who knew the grade of concrete, the load tolerances, the ventilation math. That answer was still buried somewhere in the structure itself. The answer the structure held wasn't in the chamber. It was past it, because the chamber, with all its weight, all its engineered permanence, was not the destination. It was a waypoint. Behind the reinforced wall, past the ventilation stack, the structure continued. And what continued was a tunnel. Not a crawl space, not a utility corridor. A tunnel, tall enough to walk, wide enough to carry equipment through, lined in the same poured concrete as the chamber walls. Built with the same deliberate, unhurried precision. Someone had planned this, not as a room you hide in, but as a route you travel through. The tunnel runs nearly 400 feet. That's longer than a city block, cut straight through the caliche and sandstone beneath a Santa Fe property that, above ground, looked like a high-end estate and nothing more. It doesn't loop back. It doesn't branch. It runs in one direction and terminates, not beneath the main house, not beneath the pool or the garage, but beneath a secondary structure at the far edge of the property. A building whose public records listed it as a guest cottage. A guest cottage, according to those filings, with no basement. That discrepancy is not a paperwork error. You don't pour 400 feet of reinforced concrete tunnel toward a building and forget to mention the basement on the permit. Which closes one question. Was this built for survival, for secrecy, or something more specific? And opens a harder one immediately. What is actually inside that secondary structure, and why was it so carefully misrepresented in the public record? What they found inside that secondary structure was not a guest cottage in any recognizable sense of the term. No bedroom, no kitchen, no furniture arranged for a visiting friend. What the tunnel terminated into was a room, or a suite of rooms, configured for operations, workbenches, cable management bolted to the walls, conduit runs that had nothing to do with residential wiring. The kind of infrastructure you install when the work being done requires dedicated power, dedicated communication lines, and a reason nobody walking the property above would ever need to come down here. But the detail that stopped investigators was the communications array. Hardware mounted in racks, some of it dating to the late 1990s. Components from an era when this kind of equipment was expensive, specialized, and not something you ordered from a catalog. And here is what mattered more than the age of it. It had been maintained. Cables replaced, certain modules swapped for newer equivalents. The dust patterns on the floor told a specific story. Some sections undisturbed for years, others showing recent foot traffic, recent handling. Someone had been in this room not long ago, not to look around, to work, which collapses the comfortable explanation that this was all a relic. Something built long ago, sealed up, and forgotten. You don't swap out components in a forgotten room. You don't keep a forgotten system running. Someone knew this space existed, knew how to reach it, and was actively keeping it functional. The question the tunnel always implied has now sharpened into something with edges. Who was maintaining this? And the last time they came down here, what were they doing? So the question of who was maintaining it, and when they were last here, runs directly into a harder problem. Because the moment investigators tried to establish a timeline for when any of this was built, the records stopped cooperating. The estate's permit history is not complicated. There is a 1998 filing for a standard foundation renovation, the kind of permit pulled for crack repair, drainage correction, routine structural reinforcement. Nothing unusual. The city approved it. The contractor completed it. Case closed, on paper. Except for the concrete, the contractor's own invoices, not a government estimate, not an outside calculation, but the billing records the contractor generated. Log a pour volume roughly 3 times what a foundation patch would consume. You cannot fix surface cracks with that much concrete. You cannot correct drainage with that much concrete. What you can do with that much concrete is build walls, pour floors, seal rooms, enclose a space that is not supposed to exist under a description that says it doesn't, which means someone authorized a construction project and documented it as something else. The permit is real. The work underneath it is not what the permit describes. and no name attached to either record makes the gap between them close. The maintenance question has its answer in the concrete. Someone built this deliberately, under cover of legitimate paperwork, and then kept coming back. The last visit wasn't curiosity. It was upkeep on something still considered worth keeping. Someone built it deliberately, under false paperwork, and kept coming back. That much is established. Gene Hackman was not a man who frightened easily, or who talked about fear in ordinary terms. But in a 2001 interview buried in a magazine archive and rarely cited since, he named it directly. The thing that frightened him most, he said, was not death. It was dependence. Dependence on systems, on other people, on the assumption that infrastructure would hold when you needed it to. That's a specific kind of dread, not abstract anxiety, a precise operational fear about what happens when the structures you're supposed to rely on stop working. And it maps almost exactly onto what was built underneath the property, a structure designed to function when nothing above it does. Hackman's documented obsessions ran in a consistent direction: Cold War history, the mechanics of self-reliance, a deep, well-documented distrust of institutions, government, financial, social, the kind of worldview that doesn't produce panic rooms, it produces planning. But planning like this doesn't happen alone, and that's the loop the records refuse to close. Did Hackman design this in response to a fear he'd already named, or did someone advise him to build it? And if so, who authorized a construction project documented as something else entirely? And why did they need the description to be wrong? The question of who helped design this structure doesn't stay abstract for long, because buried in the original construction drawings, the same drawings filed under a description that bore no resemblance to what was actually built, there are annotations, handwritten, marginal notes in a shorthand that engineers who've reviewed the documents recognize immediately. The abbreviations are Standard Army Corps of Engineers field documentation notation, not architectural shorthand, not the kind of notation a civilian contractor picks up from a trade manual. The specific compression, the way load tolerances and drainage specs are abbreviated, reflects a working vocabulary developed inside a particular institutional culture and used habitually by people trained inside it. A civilian architect designing a wine cellar has no reason to know that notation exists, let alone use it consistently across multiple pages. Hackman's name is on the property. His signature is on the permits. But signatures on permits don't tell you who was in the room when the specifications were written. They don't tell you who held the pen on those margins. Whoever made those annotations understood both the structural requirements and the need for the surface documentation to say something different. That's not a coincidence of training. That's intent. So the question the records leave open isn't whether Hackman feared something. It's whether the answer to that fear came from somewhere, and someone official enough to know exactly how to build it, and exactly how to make sure nobody could prove they did. And if someone official helped design this, the objects found inside start to read differently. Not as a wealthy man's eccentricities, as a curated selection made by someone who understood exactly what a person would need, and exactly what a person would fear. The sealed container is the piece that keeps pulling attention. Investigators initially assumed it held financial records, the kind of thing an estate attorney would want secured, or personal correspondence, letters maybe, the sort of private archive a private man would protect. It wasn't that. What was inside were research files, detailed ones, studies on infrastructure vulnerabilities, scenarios modeling cascading grid failure across interconnected regional systems, and demographic analyses focused specifically on the population density of the American Southwest. Not clippings, not amateur printouts. Structured research with source data. The question that opens is obvious and uncomfortable. Was Hackman preparing for something specific? Did he believe with enough conviction to build for it that something was coming? Not as a vague cultural anxiety, but as a dateable, survivable event? And that question folds directly back into the one the records still haven't answered. The unnamed advisor, the figure whose presence shows up in the annotations, in the structural decisions, in the gap between what the permits say and what the ground contains. Who they were, and what their relationship to Hackman actually was, is the thread the artifacts keep pointing toward but won't resolve. The unnamed advisor is one thread, the people closest to Hackman are another, and they pull in the same direction. because a structure of that scale, built over years, requiring sustained contractor access and ongoing maintenance, doesn't exist in total isolation. Someone knew. The question is how many and what exactly they knew. His wife of more than 30 years, when interviewed by estate attorneys, stated she had never been in the study basement and had understood it to be a mechanical room, a description that matches no feature of the actual space. The room described as mechanical contained none of the systems that designation implies. What it contained was documented elsewhere entirely, so either she was mistaken about a space she'd lived adjacent to for decades, or the description she offered was the one she'd been given, and accepted without pressing further. That distinction matters. Willful ignorance and genuine ignorance leave different marks, and the estate record doesn't resolve which one applies here. Staff accounts follow a similar contour: awareness of restricted areas, instructions not to enter, explanations that were thin enough to invite questions but weren't questioned. The access was controlled, the story around it was consistent, which means Hackman didn't just build a secret, he managed one, actively, across the people who shared his daily life. And the fact that it held for as long as it did tells you something about the weight of his authority in that house. What Hackman built wasn't just architecturally unusual, it was, almost certainly, legally complicated in ways that are still unresolved. And the authority he exercised over the people around him, the managed story, the accepted explanations, runs directly into the question of what the estate knew, and when, and what that means now. Because ignorance, even if genuine, doesn't dissolve legal exposure, it just changes who carries it. Under federal statute, certain classes of hardened private construction, reinforced, climate-controlled, designed to withstand specific categories of external event, require disclosure to designated federal agencies. The threshold isn't high, it's tied to structural specifications, not intent. And this structure almost certainly meets it. Which means the estate may have been in technical violation for 25 years, not because anyone necessarily knew that, but because the law doesn't require you to know. It requires you to disclose. That's a different standard entirely. Jurisdiction is the next problem. If federal agencies move to assert authority over the structure, and there are grounds, the estate loses the ability to treat it as private property in the ordinary sense. It can't be appraised cleanly. It can't be transferred. It sits in a legal category that most probate courts have never handled. What gets resolved first? The question of who owns what was built in secret, or the question of whether the people who lived above it had any idea what they were living above. Hackman's estate isn't the first time investigators have pulled back a layer of ordinary-looking property and found something that didn't belong in any residential category. The legal exposure described above, the disclosure requirements, the jurisdictional fog, isn't novel. It's just rarely surfaced because the people who built these structures were, almost by definition, good at not surfacing things. The 1990s saw a quiet surge in high-net-worth bunker construction that never made a single headline. Not survivalist compounds in the rural West. Not the fortified retreats that occasionally leaked into tabloids. Sophisticated systems, built under ordinary-looking properties, by people who had specific and well-founded reasons to believe that ordinary was not going to be enough. Retired intelligence figures, executives who had testified before federal bodies, a small number of prominent entertainers and public personalities who had, in the preceding decade, become the subject of credible threat assessments. The construction firms involved were specialized, discreet, and bound by non-disclosures that outlasted the projects themselves. This was not a subculture. It was closer to a quiet industry, which puts a sharper edge on what sits beneath the Hackman estate. Because if this structure fits a pattern, and structurally, legally, chronologically, it does, then the question isn't only what Hackman built, it's whether federal agencies, now that they're inside, will treat this as a one-off curiosity, or whether jurisdiction over this tunnel becomes the first domino in something considerably larger. Whether it becomes the first domino depends on a question federal investigators have not yet answered publicly. What exactly were they looking at when they walked into the communications room? Because the tunnel itself, the construction grade, the shielded conduits, the atmospheric controls, all of that fits the pattern. Expensive, deliberate, professionally executed. But the pattern doesn't explain everything they found in there. And one detail, more than any other, has refused to resolve. In the communications room, investigators documented a logbook, regular entries, running continuously through a date 11 days before Hackman's death. The handwriting does not match his, not a close approximation, not a stylistic shift that age or illness might produce. A different hand, consistently, across multiple entries. Who was making those entries? What were they recording? Was someone else using this space? And if so, under what arrangement? And with whose knowledge? Those questions have no public answer. The sealed doors explain themselves, more or less. The atmospheric controls suggest preservation. The shielded communications infrastructure suggests operational intent. But a logbook in another person's hand, running almost to the day of his death, does not fit neatly into any of those explanations. It suggests the tunnel was not dormant. It suggests it was, in some capacity, still in use. And it raises the hardest question this investigation has produced: whether what sits beneath the Hackman estate was ever, in any meaningful sense, only his. Someone was making those entries. That is not speculation, that is what the evidence says. A different hand, consistently across multiple entries, running almost to the day Gene Hackman died. And then, on the last page, 4 words. 4 words that federal investigators have read and have not released. Whatever they say, someone wrote them knowing, or not knowing, that the man whose name was on the deed had 11 days left. 4 words that may explain everything in that tunnel, or explain nothing, or ask a question of their own. We don't know. That is where the record stops. But here is what the record does say, taken whole. A man who spent his career inhabiting people who couldn't trust the world around them, built, beneath the ground, something that cost more than most people's homes, and served no purpose that comfort or convenience can explain. He sealed it. He controlled its atmosphere. He ran shielded conduit through it. He kept it off every public record he could manage. And someone else, near the end, was still logging entries in it. What does that add up to? It depends on what those 4 words say. It depends on who wrote them. It depends on answers that haven't come, and may not. What we're left with is the tunnel itself, cold, deliberate, and still waiting.